as a kid, always really into making things. I was the classic, kind of Lego kid, taking things apart, wanting to understand how things are made.
I'm Robin Johnson, this is Yours for the Making, and I'm joined by award-winning furniture designer maker Laurent Peacock.
I have to think about, does it work well enough and does it look good enough?
This show tells the story of the makers, the people that create things, whether it's in wood or metal, whether they're artists or musicians or chefs. It doesn't matter. I'm going to tell their story.
When you're putting stuff out into the world, especially into the world of social media, where people do not hold back.
Yeah.
If something's rubbish, you're going to hear about it in 12 different ways. So it's kind of daunting, but you have to at the same time not let it paralyze you. You need to still be willing to do it, get it out there.
I'm Robin Johnson, this is Yours for the Making, and I'm joined by award-winning furniture designer maker Laurent Peacock. Laurent, thanks for coming in. So, you're a South London-based designer maker. You make incredible wooden furniture, and you are a recipient of the, let me get this right, I can't remember what it's called, the Bespoke Guild Mark.
Yeah.
For furniture design, making.
Yeah.
How did it all start for you?
It started way back, really, if I'm going to be honest. I was, as a kid, always really into making things. I was the classic, kind of Lego kid, taking things apart, wanting to understand how things are made. And kind of fast forward from that all the way through school, it was technical drawing, it was DT, making stuff, bit of woodwork, but really it was that kind of inquisitiveness into what is this thing and how is it made and what's it made from. That eventually took me to an industrial design degree.
Oh really?
Yep.
Wow,
so that
cool.
was where I thought I was heading at the time, but what I realized actually by the end of that, this is kind of the late 90s, early 2000s, when I finished the course, it was very much about designing kind of widgets. It was all, plastic, injection molding. And even by the time I'd finished the course, I was kind of like, I'm not sure this is quite for me. It was all sort of stuff for mass production, often thousands of miles away. And I kind of was already a little bit kind of jaded, I guess, which sounds a bit sad coming out of uni. But eventually I took a bit of a detour, but couldn't kind of get that hands-on practical side of just making things kind of out of my mind. So it was at that point that I decided to kind of take a bit of a shift. I had been working in research for quite a few years, and thought, actually, I need that creative side back in my life. I need to get more kind of hands-on. It was always in my degree, it was always the kind of prototyping, model making. That was the stuff that really kind of got me energized. And I thought, I need some of that. So I retrained. I went to Robinson House and did their furniture making course. And that's what really kind of brought me into the world of wood and kind of sparked that side of things. Wood is such a lovely tactile material, and it also is approachable, which for me is quite important. You can physically manipulate the wood with your hands, with tools, simple tools. You don't need lots of machinery. They help, but you don't need lots of machinery. And that was kind of where the sort of the journey really began for me. That was where I put the creative aspect and the hands-on making side of things together. And started creating things that were purely kind of from my imagination, and learnt the skills, applied the sort of the design thinking, and came up with some pieces. And it was my first piece, the first piece really that was the kind of first creative piece that I made totally to my own design. That's the one that I submitted for the Guild Mark, and had a tense kind of 4, 5, 6 months waiting to hear whether it was actually going to going to get anything. And then I got the word that it had been awarded a guild mark, and for me that was a really big moment, because it was about validation. It was about a sense of, can I be any good at this? And that was a question that I'd had kind of all the way through, really. I set myself 3 questions that I wanted to try and answer when I took that kind of change, that career change, that different path. Was, is it something I enjoy enough? Is it something I can be good enough at to try, for other people to pay me money to do it? And can I make a living from it? I answered number 1 pretty quickly. It was very much the sort of thing that I could see myself doing day in, day out. The second question was kind of answered really at that point by the guild mark. This was sort of, people who really knew their stuff. The people who on the panel at the guild, they're people who have been doing this stuff for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. They've seen everything in that world. And for them to, go into a small room with my piece, shut the door, lock me out, kind of, really heavily kind of inspect and go over this piece and judge it in terms of its craftsmanship, its materials, its design, and then emerge from that room. And I mean, they didn't give much away at the time, but for them to have emerged from that room and go away and then chat to the other panelists, and then to get that kind of, here's your certificate, here's your kind of rubber stamp, you can kind of do this. That was really powerful for me. And it opened a few kind of doors in terms of exhibitions that I then got access to as a guild mark holder. I met a bunch of other people, fellow guild mark holders, and other designers, other makers in this sphere, and it kind of opened me up then to that world, which meant that when I kind of took that big step to go out on my own and set up my own little business, I kind of had a sort of foot in the door. I had, a network of people who I could bounce ideas off, I could ask for help from, and I could try and support as well. And I think that's one of the things that's been really quite surprising, actually, about moving into this world of furniture making, woodworking, is that I was worried coming into it relatively late on. I made this shift when I was in my late 30s, and now in my mid 40s. And I was worried that being a latecomer, I'd be surrounded by people who were really well established, but who would also be very kind of secretive. They'd kind of hold on to their knowledge and their skills, and they've spent however many years building up those skills and that knowledge and those expertise, and they would be unwilling to share and to help and to give advice. And if anything, I've found it to be almost the exact opposite of that
with most people.
Yes, yeah. I've, to be fair, I've not really come across any or many people who have been, or certainly people who have kind of given an outright no. You ask a question, they're like, look, I'm not going to tell you that. They may, I guess, skirt around your question and tell you other things that might also be helpful. They may not kind of answer it directly, but on the whole, people who are, I don't think we see each other as direct competitors, because in this, certainly in this in the kind of design space, everyone has such different styles, approaches. You're unlikely to be trying to appeal to the exact same clients, the exact same interior designers, the exact same, homeowners, people wanting to buy stuff, that you're never actually in direct competition, or very rarely. So I think that's been really encouraging about this world in the last few years. I've had people who have helped me source materials that I was finding it hard to get hold of, and that is not something I would have expected before I came into this world. That would have been really an option. What was that veneer? I saw it on that piece you posted. It was amazing. Where did you get it from? I know a guy, he's got some in his shed, I'll help you get hold of it. That's brilliant. And I hope that, if I can help other people with that sort of thing in the future, it'd be nice to kind of sort of pay that forward a bit, I guess.
Is that the plan? Do you think one day move into teaching or facilitating others?
It's not something I've thought about that much, to be honest. I like the idea of being able to help people. I don't think I'd naturally be the best teacher in a formal sense. I'm not sure I would kind of structure my help and support in a. It sounds ironic because I'm probably the most logical, rational person you'll ever meet. But the idea of putting together a course that I would then take people through in a very formal, rigid fashion, that somehow doesn't really suit me at all. I'd love, though, to be, I could imagine being a kind of mentor to someone, someone like a problem solver, someone who, if you're like, oh, I don't really know how to do this, or what's the best way to do this, or what material should I use? For someone to come to me and say, look, I've got this issue. What do you think? Can you help me? That'd be brilliant. I'm not sure being a kind of I'm not sure a teacher, even though ironically I'm, the son of two teachers, I'm not sure being a teacher explicitly would be quite where I'd want to be.
It's funny, isn't it? Because they often say that if you're born into a family of teachers, that is your destiny. One day you'll become a teacher.
Yeah. But I think you also, the flip side to that is you're quite aware of that from quite an early age. It's not that I've kind of overtly resisted it. I'm just not sure it's really where my skills lie. I'm not sure I'm that good with people, to be honest. I think one of the skills of teaching, and I've got two kids and they're both at primary school now, and we sort of have a fair bit of interaction with their teachers. And I just look at those teachers and like, I just couldn't do what you do. You're the kind of the interpersonal skills that you have to have as a teacher. They're just kind of mostly absent, I think, for me. That's partly, I think, why I work on my own in a workshop, because it's not that I'm trying to remove myself from the world entirely, but that's kind of how I like to operate. And I don't kind of feed off people in the way that I know lots of people do. Lots of people are so kind of engaging and interpersonal that that's where they both get their energy from and how they like to expend their energy. And I'm a bit more kind of, I like the quiet life. I like to kind of get my head down and just focus. I'm a doer. If I know what I need to do, I want to just kind of get on and do it. And I don't want to have to juggle a million things and be distracted too much. The irony is that when you're a one-man band, you have to juggle loads of things.
There's nothing but distraction often.
Yeah. And I find that hard. I definitely find that hard. I would love to be able to just spend all my time just making things. But if you don't do any of the other stuff, you don't have any clients and you haven't got a tax return to submit and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So there's all the necessary, I wouldn't go as far as to call them evils, but the necessaries of running a business on your own, where you have to be a kind of a jack of all trades and just figure it out and sort of suck it up. And even the stuff that you don't like doing, it's still got to be done. So I'm trying to get better at that. I'm trying to, certainly with the kind of the marketing side of things, which is absolutely not my sweet spot, just trying to get better about building a profile. And these days, mostly that means social media. It's hard. It's not my kind of, it's not my temperament to want to kind of shout about myself. I've never been one to, kind of shout from the rooftops, look at me, But
it's the same with a lot of people that do what you do.
Yeah.
They you love doing what you do because you're creating something just for the sake of creating it, because you want to create it. Possibly you may have been commissioned to do so, but quite often it'll be a speculative piece that's come from your own imagination and your kind of seed of creativity and thought. It's very difficult then to say, hey everyone, I've made this thing, look how good I am, because people like us that do that sort of thing that are not necessarily the best at then promoting it.
Yeah.
Whereas you get, teenage girls that put some lipstick on and go, look at me, I'm so amazing, look at all the followers I get, and it just seems so at complete odds to the kind of process that people like yourself are following. You making these beautiful things and then kind of, oh yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
Rather than the other way of not really having much to talk about, but then talking about it all the time and millions of people listening.
Yeah. And especially in this world, there's an element of fear in all of that, because I'm not just a maker. You know, if I was one of these guys who people would come to and say, look, here's a fully worked up drawing, can you just go and make it? I'd be like, absolutely, I'll make it well. But because most of what I'm doing is I'm making things either that I've entirely come up with myself, or that I've had a pretty big input into. You know, if I'm doing a commission for a client, private client, often I'm the one who's kind of driving the design, and obviously take their feedback. But essentially it's my idea, it's my baby. So it's such a personal thing. So you take something that you've thought up, you've brought into the world, and then you put that in front of people and say, judge it. You know, you tell me what you think of this. That's a really quite a scary position to put yourself in, because the feedback that comes back, I mean, it's brilliant if it's positive, but if it's not, that, you know, that kind of cuts.
Yeah.
So that's always on the back of my mind. So when you're putting stuff out into the world, especially into the world of social media, where people do not hold back, you know, if something's rubbish, you're going to hear about it in 12 different ways. So it's kind of daunting, but you have to at the same time not let it paralyze you. You need to still be willing to do it, get it out there. And criticism is useful, it's valid, as long as it's kind of constructive and not just not just insulting or, you know, demeaning, whatever, or, you know, well, I'm better than you, that kind of thing. So I'm trying to get better at making that kind of noise, but trying to do it in a way that still fits with kind of who I am and what the work is about. But it's a balance. It's not a balance I think I've really struck quite right yet.
I always think that the kind of fine furniture, sculpture, super fine, the artistic side of furniture making and sculpture, wood turning, that sort of thing, I always think that there's a big gap between the very few people that are the toast of all the galleries, that are, their work's being taken around all the shows in London, Paris, Milan, Miami, New York, whatever, and their stuff is shipped around everywhere and everyone knows it, and the prices commanded are incredibly high, if you can even buy it. Yeah, you know, if it's so exclusive that it's not even for sale, you know. And then there's like, just probably in parallel with that, people that are as skilled and in many cases more skilled, more creative, and probably producing, difficult to quantify, but probably producing work of that same caliber, if not better, but aren't represented by a gallery or a PR company or an agency, at least. You know, how do you operate in that kind of sphere? Because unless you're doing everything yourself, how are you selling your work? How are you getting your work out to people? How are you getting people to know that you're there without kind of jumping around going, oh, here I am, and leaving yourself open for criticism and negative feedback? I always think that's a really difficult place to be in. I mean, we're not anywhere, we're not making any kind of stuff like that. We get given a drawing, a design intent, we redraw it, we make it, we deliver it, happy days. And I know it works for us, but it's not quite where, you know, we're not exactly a factory, near enough, but you know, we're not making the same thing over and over. Everything we make here is different, and it's great, and people come to us because we can facilitate their ideas, which most people in my line of work probably couldn't do. But we kind of look at it from that creative, take that creative approach to it and make their ideas become reality. And I love it. I don't have to promote to anyone, I don't have to exhibit, I don't have to get the feedback. Most of the time no one even knows it's us that have made those things. But you know, because we've worked with the designers and stuff, all the end users, the hotel owners, the restaurant owners, whatever, it's great. I can just go under the radar, and if someone says it's crap, you know, let them say it's crap. I don't care.
No one knows.
No one knows it's mine. But if someone says it's great, wonderful, take a photo of that post and reshare it on the stories, whatever. But we kind of operate like that, and it feels quite safe doing so. Well, it's never safe because, you know, it's always reputation, but it feels safer than if I was to decide one day, right, I'm going to start making furniture with my own name on it. I wouldn't even know where or how to begin. And it certainly seems from an outside perspective, like getting picked up by those, 1 or 2 galleries, that would be the meal ticket. But also it seems incredibly competitive to be able to get to that.
It is. It's massively competitive because everyone in that space wants that kind of representation. I think, it's like musicians in the old days, musicians needing to get a record label in order to get their music out there into the world. The galleries kind of they're the gatekeepers to a lot of that. So, and there aren't very many of them. It's different if you're in the pure art world. If you're making paintings or sculptures, things that are not ever intended to be functional, you've probably got more scope there. There are more galleries, still massively competitive, but more galleries to go for. If you're talking about things that are essentially furniture, functional pieces of art, there are very few galleries in this country and even around the world that, I would say, that make that their thing.
Maybe half a dozen in this country.
Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah. Of that top end.
Yeah.
I can't think of more than 6 off the top of my head.
Yeah. And, I'd be lying if I said it wouldn't be lovely. It would be a dream to have some kind of representation like that, to be able to get exposed, in Design Miami going on at the moment. If I worked there, it'd be brilliant. I'm not saying that that's me made for life, but it would be another kind of badge of honor as a base level kind of starting point. It would be a matter of pride to be able to do that.
Yeah.
But also it can open up other opportunities into other markets and that kind of thing. So that would be great. I mean, I do have some work with galleries in the UK, but they're not anywhere near as well known and high profile as the kind of galleries that you're thinking of. So I guess the way I approach it is I try and kind of cover a bit of that spectrum. So, the kind of galleries we're talking about, the kind of work that goes into those galleries is of a particular kind. The stuff that makes it into the galleries tends to be quite sort of conceptual in nature. It has to have, and quite rightly, there's a story to it.
This is what I'm learning more and more. You need that story, but you also, it seems quite difficult from someone just likes making stuff. How do you tell that story about it, and how do you tell it in a way that the people that you want to, for me it seems disingenuous. I've made a table. I don't need to say, well, I've sculpted this from the finest ash that only came from wind-felled trees, and I now have worked it with the hand. I've just made a table knowing how to make a table and how it's going to work. So I find that for me it's a step that I'm not prepared to take just yet.
It's a difficult one because also I think I come at things often kind of more from your standpoint. As an industrial designer, for me, everything is about, not everything, but a large part of what I do, it's about material, it's about process, it's about kind of fusing those things together, doing it in unusual ways, in interesting ways, in ways that maybe I haven't done them before, even ways that I haven't seen other people do before. But that's often, not always, but often my starting point. So I'm not coming at it from a kind of an artist's mindset. I've not got some kind of sort of high-minded concept often behind the things that I'm making. I'm like, well, actually, this is a technique that I've been playing around with and I really like it. And actually, it might work really well with that material. And actually, that then lends itself to this particular form. And I can tell that kind of story. That's a sort of logical, iterative story of how did this piece come about? But that's not the story you're going to write. If that goes into a gallery, that's not the thing that's going to go on the little white plaque next to it about he made it from this material and these are the processes he's used.
Who's mucking about with a router one day and discovered that he can make these marks with this special
exactly. He dropped something on the floor and he liked the dent, and then that's not what people want to hear. So I find that if I'm at an exhibition with my work, I can tell those stories and people are still engaged with those stories, but they're a story of a different kind, a different order from the kind of stories that you need to have around pieces of work that make it into those kind of spaces. Which means that what I've wrestled with over time, and sometimes what I've kind of questioned about how other people might do it, is whether they're actually the same as me. And the stories then get kind of reverse engineered after the fact, and you come up with something that might explain or describe the piece you've ended up with, even though that wasn't actually your starting point, or whether people are actually just taking a much more creative approach to some of these pieces than I have taken with some of mine. It's sort of hard to know.
Sometimes it's very easy to know. There's certainly, I mean, I could I'm not going to name any of them, but I can certainly think of at least, a couple of designers where you look at the work and that from an industrial design perspective, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. When you see a piece that's made in a certain way and you think that's not going to last 6 months, the wood's going to dry, it's going to twist, that's going to crack, that's a weak point, that hasn't got the right finish on it. Because I'm governed by a set of rules because we make joinery and furniture that needs to be in a situation where people are going to use it regularly every day, and it needs to last at least a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
But it was when you come in, I read pieces sometimes and you see the picture of the item and you think, I mean, it's pretty, but it's useless, near enough useless. And you think, well, tell all the story you want about that, but it's still, let's say, a table that's not really going to be that good for sitting at, for eating at, and it's not going to last very long. But interestingly, I had a friend of mine, Jared, on the podcast, and he was talking about a table.
I saw that one.
He's made a table that lives outside, and it's got fungi kind of growing in it. He said, it's great and it's got no finish on it, and then eventually, fairly soon, it will decay and back into the ground. And I thought I actually quite like that. I can understand that.
Yeah.
And he's made it because of that, and it will go back into the ground. But when you see other stuff and you just think, look, you've made it with basic tools in quite a basic way. You can still see the pins holding on your little shingles and stuff like that. It's just not done very well, but you've told such a fantastic story that you now toasted the town. And I find that, personally, I find it a bit disingenuous. And I almost think that's the not great side of that higher echelon of fine furniture that I just think, whatever.
I think that's part of the challenge of the kind of the world we're in now, where so much of the way in which our work finds its way into the kind of into the public is, it's not through people physically being in the same space as your work, walking around it, looking underneath, touching it, kind of interrogating the joints, talking to me about it. It's, here are some nice images, or increasingly, here's a cleverly edited video of the thing. It's not that hard to get something that can look good in a photo. And if it only has to look good in those photos, and then the kind of the life of it beyond those photos is not irrelevant, but less important, then how crucial is it that the joints really kind of stack up to daily use and last for years? If your primary aim is to make something that has a wow factor, that looks good in the images, gets your content right, you stick it on your Instagram, it gets you a whole load of new followers, and then you move on to the next thing. And I think that's not where I want to be. I need to be making things that have the kind of the structural underpinnings. Things need to function, they need to last, but they also need to look good and have a story. And so, no pressure. Like, you just have to do everything. You have to get everything right, and that's the kind of the challenge of it. But I guess I approach it by trying not to overemphasize either one of those kind of two. If you think of it as sort of two sides to a piece, how well is it made and how long is it going to last versus how does it look? You can't focus on just one or the other. You could make tables are not difficult if you're only talking about a surface which has to stand up and not fall over. But if that's all your table can do and it looks like a dog's dinner, no one's going to want it. So you need to be able to kind of strike that balance. Everything's about balance, isn't it? Get it right where something is both functional enough. We're not necessarily talking about a dining table that everyone's, you're going to have a family of 4 people sitting at for 3 meals a day for 20 years. It might be something that just needs to look really good and last long enough to be used occasionally, brought out when
it's like the fine china.
Yeah, brought out when you've got your your posh aunt round or whatever. I don't know. I think that's, for me, when you see these, especially these kind of art furniture pieces, they're often pitched as being functional, but I think the intention is never really there for them to be genuinely functional, and that's okay. As long as that's what the person who's buying it wants and needs from it, and that's what the person who is making it understands is needed from it. totally fine. But there's a real spectrum there, from real functional stuff, which I think is a space I'm never going to compete in, because if you just are interested in function, you can buy something from any one of a number of big retailers that will serve you perfectly well, and you'll pay a fraction of what you'd have to pay to get me or anyone else to make you something totally bespoke from scratch. So I think one of the things I do struggle with it a little bit is if you imagine that on a spectrum from kind of, let's say, IKEA at one end up to art furniture in, a New York gallery where a table is going to cost you 50 grand plus or whatever. There's a really wide gap between those two ends. And where along that spectrum can I place myself? Where do I want to place myself? Because you've got that sort of function versus art spectrum. You've got kind of the practicality side of how something might be used on a daily basis. And I guess the way I kind of figure it is I have to think about, does it work well enough and does it look good enough? And can both of those sort of sides of the coin be kind of met in a way?
It's the oldest balance in the history of design, form and function.
Yeah.
And if you can get both right, you've got the winning formula. But often, as we both know, if you increase the form, the function might drop off a little bit. Unless you can find that magic formula where both are completely optimal.
Yeah.
It's tricky, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where do you put yourself out of interest on that spectrum? I would imagine you're much further towards the kind of art furniture end, but from your perspective, where would you put yourself?
I think I occupy a sort of subspectrum, if you like, because I don't just do one thing. I think partly because trying to get into that kind of more sort of art furniture space is so hard. I haven't kind of had the guts or the inclination to kind of go foursquare just for that. I know there are makers out there who are only making things to their own design, their own style, and have been successful in, they make a name for themselves, which is brilliant, and they have a really identifiable style, and that's what people come to them for.
Your tutor at Robinson House, Mark Fish,
yes.
prime example.
Yes.
His work, it's more art than it is furniture.
Yeah, for sure.
You wouldn't look at many of his pieces and go, "Oh, that's a really functional piece," but he's making it to be art rather than to be furniture.
Yeah.
And he's very much moving in those circles. But what I quite like about his stuff is that it's so unique to him. Although there's a few people now who are making similar looking things, but it's so unique to him, you can tell it's a piece of his work.
Yeah.
Pretty much instantly.
Yeah.
But there isn't the whole narrative behind it often of I've conceptualized this. It's just I've made it. It's great.
Yeah.
Which I respect. Actually, I think if you're going to make art for art's sake, just say that it's art, right? Don't have to tell the whole story behind it.
For sure. And I think that's a space I'd like to be in. I think I'd be lying if I said my long-term goal wouldn't be to be one of those people who's kind of made a name for themselves, established a style, and if people come to me then to get me to make stuff for them, it's because they know my style and they say, "Oh, I've seen what you've done. These are the pieces we really like, but can you do me a console table, or can you do me a statement chair or whatever, but in that style?" At the moment, what I do is I have a real spectrum of work from some interior designers who come to me and say that we've designed this piece. We've got this huge project. Can you make us this thing to go in the corner? Can you do us this dining table? Can you do us whatever? And I may give feedback on, well, actually the way you've designed it there, that's structurally not very sound, or, that thing's going to fall over because you've not given it a wide enough base or whatever. But that's kind of the extent of my input. And then I make the thing and I hand it over. Then I've got my kind of, the pieces I think I find the most fun often is the sort of more collaborative work, usually sometimes with interior designers, often with end clients, private clients who they kind of know what they want, but they don't always know how to describe it, how to articulate it, how to bring it to kind of life in a visual way. So I get to work with them on generating ideas, iterating, evolving, until I've got something that they're like, yeah, that's exactly what we want. And I love that process, but that often ends up then in, it's not always work that I feel like I would have chosen to make myself. It's very much, as it has to be, it's very much to their style. It's something that has generated from the nature of their space, the nature of the other pieces they have in there, the way in which they want to use a piece. Sometimes it's in that sweet spot where it's a piece that I actually love and I would have loved to have made it anyway, even if it wasn't for them. But there's an element of compromise usually. And then there's my speculative work, the pieces that I choose to make, usually in those sadly inevitable gaps between commissions where you kind of like, look, the next project isn't going to be for a couple of months. I'm not just going to twiddle my thumbs. I can do my tax return. I can do some marketing. I can do all that kind of stuff, but I don't want to just stop making. So often I'm looking around the workshop and saying, well, I've got that stack of sycamore in the corner that's kind of left over. What can I do with that? And again, it's often, pieces are often sparked by, what have I got that I can use to make it from that isn't going to cost me any money, rather than, what's this kind of great idea, great concept. Grab that material, experiment. A lot of what I do, the ideas come from kind of initial play and experimentation. So how big is that board I've got over there? What would happen if I just made a simple bench out of that one board? That gives you a sort of, gives you some parameters to work with. I think I find I'm too indecisive as a person that if you give me a total free rein, blank piece of paper, I just wouldn't kind of know where to start. So I almost need to give myself limits, which sounds a bit backwards. But if I'm saying, look, I'm going to make something, it's just that board, it's that long, it's that wide, it's that thick, there's a starting point. Maybe I've got an idea of how I want this thing to look or to function. But kind of work within self-imposed parameters gives me a kind of a structure, if you like, of how I might approach a piece. And I find that, I know some people would hate that, but I find that quite useful.
It's really interesting because if you've done a degree in industrial design, I'm assuming that you'd have been taught to follow the process of initial idea, design development, working to a brief specification, developing that design, and then prototyping whatever else. Yeah. It's interesting to hear that you look at a board, measure it, and go, "Oh, I'll make that out of that," rather than sitting down. I assumed that with that background, you'd sit down, you'd sketch out your idea, you'd do the classic design development, and then go, right, that's what I'm going to make, and then go and make it.
I do that as well.
You do that,
yeah.
As well? Okay.
It's I don't think I'm particularly consistent, if you like, in terms of how I approach things, because ideas get sparked in so many different ways that sometimes it'll be like I said, what can I make out of this board? Other times it'll be like, oh, there's this shape that I've got kind of playing around in my head, and what if I was to kind of try making that shape and repeating that shape and then fitting a load of those shapes together? Where does that get me? So I've done in the last year or so, I've done these tube chairs, which are essentially, it's all solid wood, but it kind of looks like it would probably be made out of something else, tubular steel or whatever, aluminium, which are essentially these kind of like, I think of them almost as kind of staples. If you imagine like a tube following a kind of a square arch shape, with these kind of nice, I find them quite satisfying, these kind of nice curved rounded corners. Basically made up, I say basically, it took forever. The idea around these pieces was, how do I make something that actually could be kind of a bit more repeatable, a bit more easily kind of produced, not as a kind of, pump them out manufacturing kind of line, but pieces that I could turn into almost like more of a sort of product. So I was like, I'm just going to make a load of these staples, these rounded staples. It sounded simple, huge amounts of process, took forever. But then start fitting them together. I actually did this in CAD because it was so much easier to kind of just repeat and iterate without having to actually fiddle with the real things. But turn that into a set of pieces that have a common language, but starting from a really simple standpoint of this really quite basic shape. And I really enjoyed that process. That was a great process. In like SketchUp, I had 50, 60, 70 different models of where I might take it. And there's still a bunch that I haven't made, but I made 3, like a stool, a chair, and a sort of armchair, all with the same language, playing around with some kind of wacky stain colors and that kind of thing. Took them to an exhibition and they were really well received. But they're so different from literally everything else I've ever made that you kind of, I always end up in this situation where I question, is that the right thing to do? Because does that just confuse everything further?
Is it too much of a departure from what I'm already doing?
Because I'm already saying, look, I can make exactly what you want me to make, or I can help you design something to your tastes, or I can make something that is just sort of purely out of my brain. And all of those things will be totally disparate in style as well, because I was like, oh, what about this idea? Because everything's coming from a different starting point. It's not like I don't have this sort of coherent, overarching philosophy that ties all these pieces together and makes them evidently mine. And I keep questioning whether that's a really, really big mistake. Or I speak to people and they're like, no, it's brilliant.
Maybe
it's nice to have that.
Maybe you need to decide exactly what your story is, and then.
Well, I think
maybe that's it. But maybe I'm joking about it.
No, it's true.
Maybe that's what it is.
It's one of the things that for years I've been trying to figure out is, what is that story? I can tell the story of the past. I can tell my story. I can tell the story of how I got to where I am. But what's the story around my work? And too often when I start to kind of describe it to people, as I have with you today, it kind of, and I don't know if this is the industrial designer in me, but it tends to kind of, when you boil it down, it does come back to, well, I'm kind of a bit obsessed by materials and I'm kind of inquisitive about process. And a lot of it is about taking those things and putting them together. But that doesn't lead me to, I think, what I might need, which is, why is my work the way it is? You need to probably get into my brain and sort of root around a bit in there, I guess, to figure it out. I shared a workshop with a guy a few years ago who I made this slightly unusual shaped chair for a private client. And he sort of saw this thing evolving with all these different components and weird curves and angles. And when it arrived, when I'd finished it, he kind of looked at it and said, I feel like I've now got an insight into your brain, like how your brain works, seeing this slightly kind of unconventional, it followed almost none of the rules of traditional chair making. And yet I really liked it. But I think he was implying it's not something he would have ever thought of. It's not something he would have ever probably chosen to make. But there's something in here which is kind of prompting me, guiding me, sort of somehow encouraging me to make these kinds of things. And I often say to people, I don't feel like there's a kind of a sort of signature style across my work. But then a lot of people actually, I don't know if they're just doing it to be polite, but a lot of people disagree. They kind of say, actually, I can see a commonality through the work. And it's not that every piece looks the same. And it's not that all the materials are sort of consistent. But maybe there's something that I can't kind of pick out because it's too sort of deeply ingrained in me. But maybe there is something that there's some underlying cause, which is saying, this is why you made these things in this way. And this is why you made these things in this way. And although they're not the same and you wouldn't necessarily put the two together, there's an underpinning kind of connection, invisible connection almost, that somehow makes it obvious. I still don't understand it often when people describe that to me, but a number of people independently kind of say, look, actually, there is some sense of what it means to be, a piece made by you, and it's intangible. It's hard to describe, but apparently it's there.
Well, it must be because you've made it.
Yeah.
Maybe they show an evolution, and maybe if you looked at your first pieces and the pieces you're making now, they'd look so different from each other. But if you put everything you've made in between in there in the line, it'd be the context of it would frame it in a way that you'd see the evolution of it. Maybe I don't know.
I think there's something in that. There's certainly been an evolution in terms of what what I find interesting when I look at particularly furniture. The things that I was sort of fetishizing almost when I was training were all what I would describe as the really woody pieces, so it's all about kind of the wood grain and traditional joinery, express joinery and that kind of thing. And now I look at those pieces and I can admire the skill and the technique involved. But sometimes they leave me a little bit cold. It's not what sort of energizes me anymore. I think the things now that I get more excited about when I see them are the pieces which actually sometimes they're maybe a bit ambiguous about how they're made, and it's not about using kind of the really traditional techniques, even though actually a lot of that is still kind of integral to the thing to give it the kind of the life and the longevity that it needs. But actually it's the pieces where maybe you can't tell even what it's made out of, and it's a really unusual shape. And I think that evolution in my taste has certainly kind of echoed, and I don't know if it's the kind of the cause or the symptom, if you like, but it's echoed. It's run alongside the evolution in the things that I've wanted to make. Because I'm certainly now kind of, if you sat me down tomorrow and said, look, make me a piece, I don't care what it is, make me a piece, it would probably be it more in that kind of what I would call a sort of a design space rather than a kind of woodworking space, because although those techniques are still crucial to a lot of what I make, it's not necessarily about putting them on show in the way that I probably would have chosen to. Certainly my first piece is the Guildmark piece.
Yeah.
That was all about kind of
but I think a
joinery
lot of that,
and technique and that kind of thing.
I think a lot of that, because I feel kind of the same, a lot of that is, from my point of view anyway, because you want to be able to show off that you can do those joints. Oh yeah, look, I can do let's think, like a fox wedge tenon or something like that, and I can display it because I can do it and it looks really good and I've got that technique down to a T. Or an inlaid dovetail or something like that on a box. You think, I'm going to show it off because I can do it, but then you've done it and you think, well, it's a technique that loads of people do, so why? I use it, like you were saying, you're still using those techniques. We'll still use mortise and tenon, dovetail joinery, wedge tenons and stuff. All of those things we'll still use because it's good practice. But we probably won't often put them on show now, and we'll probably make things look in our stuff that we're doing, which is, I guess, the closest to speculative work that we do, or my own furniture that never sees anywhere other than my workshop and my house. But that sort of stuff, I'll try and hide those joints, use them, but hide them and just let the form of the piece tell the story in a way. Because wood geeks will go and look at it and go, oh yes, that's a fantastic joint. A lot of them would go, oh, I think I could do better. They probably couldn't, but they'd look at it and that's the assumption, right? But for the rest of the 99% of the world who are not wood joint geeks and tool fetishists, they'll look at it and go, they'll look at the form, they'll look at the colour, the shape, the texture maybe. They'll look at the broader holistic picture of it and the focusing in on like that joint under there, or you've done a finger joint down the side or whatever it is. And that, it's a funny thing, when we first started doing a lot of furniture, I felt like I had to show off the insane level of skill that we had to validate the fact that we've been asked to make furniture for people. But now I'm kind of like almost the opposite. It's like, you want it to look nice, great. We'll make it look nice. We'll hide all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah. I can empathize with a lot of that. I think when you start out in any field, but I mean, particularly woodworking is probably a classic one for it. It's about learning the skills and it's about showing that you've got the skills. And you feel at the start like that's going to be what differentiates you. I'm going to be the most skilled maker out there. You're not. There's loads of people who are already very skilled at it. They are about as good as you need to get, or about as good as you can get. You're not going to be better than they are. You're not going to kind of out joint them. So the way you need to do it is you need to then actually find other ways of differentiating. And more often than not, that's about design, or it's about maybe it might be about approach to materials or ethos or whatever. So a lot of people, I think, come into woodwork and they sort of obsess about learning the skills, but actually the skills are just the starting point. That's just kind of the base level. You're never going to make it, well, not never, but it's hard to make it in the world of furniture making if you don't have those skills. But you need a lot more on top of that in order to actually be successful and sell work, and certainly at the kind of the higher price points. So that's the kind of slightly depressing side about it in a way, is that, you know, actually getting good is only the first step. Then you need to get quick, and then you also need to be able to layer the kind of the creativity on the top, and that's ultimately going to be what is most likely, I think, to differentiate you from 100% other makers.
Million people can use a mortiser. Well, maybe not a million, but a lot of people could use a mortiser and a tenor now. Or, you know, even more people can use chisels and saws.
Yeah.
Some of them can do it really well, but how many people can come up with a fantastic design for a table or a chair?
Yeah. There's one thing that I found really interesting about exhibiting at exhibitions. I've done quite a range of them, from the old kind of now defunct CCD in Cheltenham through to, you know, Decorex and the big shows and London Craft Week and that kind of thing. And you can always tell, you speak to loads of people at these shows, and it's brilliant. And it's something, even though I said I'm not really a people person, it's one of the things I actually do enjoy doing, talking to people about my work. And you can usually tell a maker from a kind of, you know, member of the public. I know, you know, everyone's human, right? But makers will approach your work in such a different way. You know, they'll be like, "Oh, here, and what's that?" And they'll ask a totally different set of questions to someone who just sees your work from the other side of the gallery, walks over to it, is like, "I like this. Can you tell me about it?" And they're not interested in specifically what materials you've used.
They want to hear the story.
They want to hear the story. And on balance, the person who's more likely to buy that piece
100%
is not the person who's interrogating every joint and asking you every single technique you've used. It's the person who's like, "I quite like it. How did you think of it?" And that's where the stories count. And that's where I kind of feel like I could do with more kind of material, if you like, because you can tell the personal stories and you can tell the thought process. And sometimes that is enough. But sometimes, and this is for the galleries in particular, they need to be able to tell your story. And it's not a story about you, it's a story about the concept. And that's, I think, where I'm sort of trying to figure out different ways of approaching, different ways of kind of sparking those ideas to get into that space.
It's so true, because what those people that are asking you how to make it, probably they're thinking, I can make one of these, or I can do something similar. I wonder how he's done that. Oh, okay, I'm going to do that.
I've had that happen. I did CCD a few years in a row. This is going back a bit now. And one year I met a lovely chap, asked me all sorts of questions about the console table, the Seeker console table that I got the Guillemot for. He asked me loads and loads of questions. And then I didn't really think much more of it. Following year, I was back there showing some other pieces, and he came over and he was like, "Oh, I spoke to you last year. Can I just show you some pictures?" And he got his phone out. He's like, "This is what I made." And it wasn't the exact same thing, but he was a member of a church, and he'd made these, I can't remember, they're almost like planters, but I think they were for supporting like giant candles or something. Exactly the same style, same materials, just a slightly different, like a compressed, mine was a sort of elongated form, his was kind of compressed. And he took pride in telling me about how he'd managed to use all of the same techniques that I told him about, and he'd managed to find all of the same materials. And he's not selling these things. He's made them for his local church. I'm not bothered. He was in his 70s or whatever. But it kind of felt weird that someone is so, in some ways it was good, right? That he was so obvious about it. He wasn't trying to kind of undermine it or put it out into the world and claim that all of the ideas were his. But it's quite a blatant act, which you don't necessarily expect when you're in this kind of world, I guess.
It's kind of tricky because, you know, they say that copying is the highest form of flattery, right? But at the same time, I don't know how I'd react to that. I'd probably initially, my inner ape would probably be quite offended by that, because that'd be work that I've done to all the time in R&D that you'd spent and invested in your creativity and using those methods and stuff like that and that design. But then at the same time, you'd have to kind of think, well, hats off to you. You've done a good job.
I think if he'd been a professional, it would have bothered me, but he was a hobbyist, and I just kind of figured that, you know, fair play to you. You made that in your shed. You know, I had more than a shed to make that in, and it was still a tricky thing to make. So
where do you operate out of?
So I'm in a shared workshop in the lovely rural Sussex countryside. So there's just a few of us there. renting bench space. I have a fully kitted out workshop, but it's not something that I've been in a position yet to kind of fully set up for myself. So it works out pretty well. Good machinery, well maintained, good space. And I get the sort of sweet spot of being able to work mostly on my own, but on those days where you need another pair of hands. It recently had a 65 mil oak slab, 220 kilos delivered. I'm not lifting that thing on my own, 4 meter long slab. So it's good to have other people on hand so we can
From English Woodlands Timber?
Yes.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Excellent.
The guys down there sorted me out nicely. So it's good to be able to help other people in that way and have others, kind of help lug stuff. And on the softer side, what do you think of this? Does it look all right? Or, should that be a bit longer or shorter? Or, I was thinking of using this joint. Does that make sense? That kind of thing, which even though, I've been doing it for a little while now, there are always going to be people out there who have different levels of experience in certain areas. And where I'm based, it's actually a little sort of private furniture school. So the guy, John, who runs it, he's primarily a restorer. He's been in the business for decades. So he's always got, a tool, a special little tool that for, some specific little job, or a little bit of, wisdom on actually, here are some finishes that they would have used 300 years ago. And actually maybe it's worth trying. So it's always good to kind of still be learning, because I've still only scratched the surface, I think, really. There's so much to learn, so much to try, that I think if you fall into the trap of thinking, I know it all now and I'm going to kind of,
you never
lock down into my own little world and just sort of get on with it, you're going to, cutting yourself off like that is never going to be a good thing. So actively, going back to my original point about, having this kind of woodworking, furniture making kind of network, there are always going to be things that you don't know that someone else that might know. It's a bit of a weird sentence, but you have to be open to that, I think, because otherwise you kind of stifle yourself. You need to be willing and able to say, I'm not sure about this. What do you reckon? And hope that there are other people who are willing to offer their advice.
Especially if I think that's a really positive thing to be able to recognise, but also to have access to, because, especially if they're people that have seen you work and you know them and you know what their strengths and weaknesses are as well. That's probably a really good thing to be able to just bounce ideas off, because they'll tell you truthfully, well, maybe that's not so great, or actually that's fantastic. And sometimes you just need that little bit of encouragement.
Yeah. Particularly from that kind of more sort of technical standpoint. I'm always a little bit wary of asking people purely for their opinion in a sort of subjective, creative way. If you just put something in front of someone and say, do you like it? You're going to get, you could get any kind of feedback.
Yeah, you need to close that question right down, don't you? What do you think of the finish on that leg?
Yeah. Does this look good? I mean, there's 100 answers to that question, and it will only be still the answers of that one person in a purely subjective way. So I try not to I think trust my gut when it comes to how something looks, and crucially how something feels. I think one of the big things for me, I think, which is perhaps one of the threads through my work, is a piece that I make, it has to be physically kind of interactive. It's about tactility. It's about, the kind of materials. I work almost entirely in wood, and wood is one of the most satisfying, most tactile, warmest kind of materials you can get. And it invites touch. And what you can't get, through this sort of virtual world of putting things out into social media, video and stuff is great. You can now see what things look like. You can hear what things look like, smell-o-vision. You can always smell, taste it, but you can't touch it. Exhibitions are great for that. But so much of what I do is about actually inviting someone to be like, is that flat or is that a texture? Can you see that? Can you touch it? How does that feel when you touch it? What's that transition along that edge? Is that a square? Is that a nice round over? Is that a texture? Is that an applied texture? Is it the natural texture? I want all these questions to kind of go through people's minds. So I've been playing around quite a lot recently with either kind of enhancing the natural texture of the wood grain, or more often actually kind of imparting texture to it through carving, through other kinds of textures, both by hand, with machines, trying to kind of get that sort of almost like a hybrid approach to how can I make this area, not like I'm going to texture the whole thing, but there are kind of zones, there are areas where actually if you're at a dining table, you probably want the top to be flat. It's functional that way. But actually the number of people who will sit at a dining table, especially if it's a dining table which they can tell is, not kind of off the shelf, they're going to put their hands underneath. They're going to be like, what does that feel like? And if that's rough, you're done for. The best thing, the kind of basic would be you get it nice and smooth. But actually, if that's an unexpected little texture under there, they'll be like, oh, hold on. Someone's thought about that and paid attention to that. And that says something about the piece more generally, which I think is quite a powerful thing. And I think, you'd probably be the same. But as makers, often we would find that it's not enough, it's not good enough just to stop at, you lovingly finish all the areas that everyone sees, but then the stuff underneath, it's like, well, we don't worry about that because people probably won't look. Often the underside of something is just as important to us as the top side is, because you will have these kind of wandering hands or, roaming eyes that will kind of take an interest. And that's where a lot of the time and effort draws away, and you could argue that from a commercial perspective, is it worth it? Because there's a load of extra time and work involved in that. But can you afford not to do it? Because if you deliver something which doesn't have that, which isn't finished in the way it needs to be in all the places that are accessible, then you've fallen short, I think. So for me, a piece being interactive and tactile is kind of, on my list of criteria, it'd be right up there, because it's one of those things, people are increasingly living their lives kind of virtually through screens, but it's the thing that I just can't see ever disappearing. We still have to live in a physical world. We'll still have to move around in a physical world, eat physical food. Like, you need a physical environment around you which can kind of not just perform, but that kind of enriches that life and that experience. And I know it's encouraging that there does seem to be a gradual shift towards, better quality things and pieces that people can kind of cherish and kind of carry with them through their lives, rather than kind of buy and throw away 2 years later. That's quite a rewarding idea, but I think it's still not sort of embedded enough. I think there's still, sadly, too much cheap stuff bought and discarded. But I get why. It's not everyone can afford to get someone to make them something by hand, or even if not by hand, totally from scratch. So it's a luxury. It's a luxury just to kind of start off in that space. But it's nice to be able to do it for the people who can. It'd be lovely to be able to say, look, it could be more sort of democratic than that, and somehow make it more accessible.
But how do you do that without compromising on the quality and everything else?
I don't know. I don't know if that's possible. It's a nice idea. It does irk me a bit that, I'm essentially making work that only wealthy people can afford, and that doesn't sit totally well with me. But at the same time, if I'm going to make work and value my time and skills and effort appropriately, I'm not making much money from this, then I need to charge what I charge. I need people to recognize the value, not purely monetarily, but the value in the kind of the quality and the kind of customization which it offers. And that can't and probably never will come cheap.
I don't think there's a way that it ever will, unless, let's say we move into a universe where everyone's got their own 3D printer, and then you're selling a design really cheap, and their own kind of 3D printer thing is making it for them. I think if you're going to go to someone and get them to make you something, it's always going to cost more money than going buying it from IKEA or wherever.
Yeah. True.
So one question I ask every guest on the podcast is if you went back to say 18-year-old Laurent, what advice would you give him?
Probably try and be more decisive. I think in almost every area of my life, I've been a bit kind of, well, there's this over here, but then there's this as well. As a kid, I was like, well, I was super nerdy, super academic, but then I was also super sporty. Which of those two am I? I don't know. I'll kind of not pursue either of them directly. And now, with as I was describing with my work, am I a pure maker? Am I a designer? I can't really decide. So I'll try and do both. And I guess I kind of worry that over the years, I've sort of maybe ended up hedging a bit too much because I've been maybe scared of fully committing to one personality, one approach that, what if it's not the right one? So it's something that I've not managed to master. I guess it's something, I don't know actually if you can just make yourself more decisive, but I think if I'd started sooner thinking in this way, maybe by the time I got back to 40 plus, I'd have figured it out. So maybe be a bit more confident in making decisions, even if you don't have all the information. I think I'm naturally inclined to want all of the information before I make a decision, and in the real world, often doesn't happen.
Rarely does that happen.
Yeah, exactly.
And where can people see your work? Obviously, you've got Instagram.
I do. I have Instagram. I have a website. I have some pieces in the Contemporary Applied Arts Gallery in Marylebone in London. A few pieces there. I have a few pieces in Artisan Alchemy Gallery in Birmingham. And I go every now and then to exhibitions. I don't have any specific ones lined up right now, but I've been doing London Craft Week for the last few years, which has been quite interesting. So come find me. I've got a weird name. I'm easy to find online.
The one and only Laurent Peacock.
Exactly. So yeah, most of my work, it's on Instagram and my website, and there's a load of images on there. So people can get in touch and find out more.
Well, they should. I love your work. I think it's fantastic. And it's been a real eye-opener, this podcast, to get a snapshot into what it is to be like to be Laurent Peacock. Thanks ever so much for coming on.
Wonderful world. Thank you.
See you again.
Cheers.